Okay, out there, welcome to another episode of Forbidden Science, also known as FSUFO. Today's show is going to look a little bit different. I'm flying solo, but I'm hardly alone today because I do have a guest. I wouldn't want to fly solo totally that way. And our guest today happens to be the very first one who's here for a second time. And that happens to be Elliott Van Dusen. Now, Elliott is the executive director of the PPRI, a paranormal research group that has membership across North America. He also recently retired from a lengthy career with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and has a unique perspective on UFOs and all things paranormal. And we're lucky to have him here today because we've got a lot to talk about. And Elliott, his voice comes from a direction where we should all listen. So, Elliott, there we are.
Thanks for having me back.
Boy, yeah. Are you okay with what's behind you there? That's kind of an ominous. I'm telling you, it has an impact, right? You see a lot of bookcases, like with me, you see a lot of virtual backgrounds and whatever, from the Hanging Gardens of Babylon to whatever, but that's
Yeah,
kind of
I'm a
nice.
I'm a huge Conjuring Universe fan, so I think I picked her up from the internet. I think it came from the UK,
Oh,
and
it all comes.
you get fancy ones where if you turn the lights off, the paint will actually glow in the dark, but that one doesn't. But it's
No, that's adequate for that is the effect. The thing is, if it doesn't come from the internet, it always ends up there. So, that's the
true,
thing. Look,
true.
the last time you were on our episode, and by the way, if you didn't hear with that, you probably did. I don't know how this green room thing, I'm old school. Um, but the thing is, you're the first guest that we've had back for a second time. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And one of them is the fact that on the last episode, you talked about a book that was about to come out, but now it's been released here. And we'd like to get between the covers of that a little bit and see why people should download it, buy it, borrow it, beg, steal it, whatever sort of thing. And the title is what? More Supernatural
More
Encounters? Is that
more
correct?
s- more supernatural encounters from law enforcement, and a friend of mine that works in the Halifax public library system told me a couple days ago that they actually just ordered a few more copies of that and my second book, which would be Supernatural Encounters: True Paranormal Accounts from Law Enforcement. So that's pretty cool. If you're in the HRM area, you should be able to find it in the library system.
That's cool. And you know what else people don't realize? A lot of people that when, if you rush out and you don't want to put down the money for Elliot's book, but you really want to get between the covers and read it. If you go to the library, enough people borrow that and it shows up on the sample. I'm sure you would have done the paperwork with the, what is it called? The Canada Council and that.
Yes, yeah.
Um, every February we get little checks, don't we, for the books that sit in library that are borrowed. It's one of the kind of nifty things that Canada does for authors to help out, and so it's good. And sometimes when sales drop off, those checks can rival some of the royalty payments as books peter out.
Yes, and
Um,
what I started doing actually is any sales from my book, I just started putting all the proceeds back into paranormal phenomena research and investigation. Because I do subscribe to certain journals, like the Journal of Parapsychology. I just renewed my Zoom subscription, which gives you the unlimited amount of time to network with people and talk with people. So, certainly there's lots of operating fees when you run an organization like that. So I started to put any proceeds from the sales of my book back into the organization.
Man, you're hardcore. That's dedication, I must admit. And you know, what else would you say? Giving back, paying it forward, all those kind of trendy things. But it's great of you to do that sort of thing. Well, like I'm saying, let's dive between the covers a little bit and talk about some of the cases. And I know there's a lot more in that book than UFO, but let's start with a couple of UFO cases, and we can look into some of the other things too that I think have a bearing on this.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the ones that I think is interesting for so many reasons I've heard about, but I'll get you to tell me because I'm just skimming the surface of it these days. Is the Escazona UFO case. So Can you
Yeah, yeah.
put
So
us in?
I had interviewed a female RCMP officer, and in a small indigenous community located in Cape Breton Island called Eskizoni, in Nova Scotia. Um, they were they were working in March of 2020, and it was just when the world started to shut down everything due to the pandemic.
Mm.
So it was fairly quiet out, and it was her and her partner working a night shift, a male partner. And as she was patrolling through Eskizoni, she noticed a light up in the sky, and she described it like a laser beam. It looked like there was some sort of laser beam coming down from this object. Um, so she radioed her partner and asked if he could see it, and he did see it, and it was moving extremely fast. They said it wasn't anything that could maneuver conventionally. And they pulled into a parking lot together, and they stopped there and they watched the phenomena for quite a while, and they could see three blasts of what looked like a laser beam coming from it. And it was funny. The female RCMP officer started to flash her flashlight at the object, and her partner became very afraid of that in case the object engaged them. And he told her that he was going back to the office. She stayed there in the parking lot for a few more minutes to watch the object, but then it just kind of simply disappeared. Your typical UFO exit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it was kind of interesting. I went on the ufology research in Manitoba website and checked to see if there was any other UFO sightings reported from Eskizoni in March of 2020, and there hadn't been. For those that aren't familiar with the ufology research in Manitoba, it's run by ufologist Chris Rakowski, and of course he collects all the UFO sightings in Canada and then publishes the Canadian UFO survey every year. And quite a bit of detail in those reports sometimes. But there was nothing in Eskizoni around that time. Uh, but it was interesting, though, about a month after she had experienced her UFO on April 25th of 2020, 365 kilometers away in Cole Harbour, Nova Scotia, somebody had witnessed a similar type object. In Chris Rakowski's report, it was quoted as saying lights in a straight line like a laser moving horizontally and then disappeared all at one time. Almost sounded identical to the type of object that they had seen in Eskizoni. That incident was reported to the Mutual UFO Network for investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that's all that I could find on it. Of course, I did all the typical research, checking for satellites and things like that in the
Mm-hmm.
area, but nothing stood out there. I thought it was really interesting though that there was two UFO sightings in Nova Scotia within a month period that were very, very similar.
Yeah. When you say like a laser beam, do you mean just that tight and cohesive? Like, was there some detail about the nature of the light? Like, was it really
Well,
just like
it, in that report from Chris Rakowski, the second one in April, they said they used the words like a laser beam. But when I spoke to the RCMP officer when she saw it, she actually saw what looked like a laser beam coming from the object. Um, so there is that little bit of, uh,
Yeah.
you know, kind of vagueness there, I guess. It would be interesting if you were able to go and just do a follow up question with that person, but of course you'd have to
Yeah.
contact Chris Rakowski and go
Yeah.
through the Privacy Act and stuff like that. But
You know,
the it's funny because I think in the last episode that I had talked to you guys about, we talked about the Delaunay UFO sighting
yeah,
up in the
up
Northwest
north. Yeah.
Territories, and that one had a laser coming from it as well. That's what prompted somebody in the community to contact them. So it's always interesting when you hear these UFO sightings where they're talking about a light coming from it or a laser or you know tractor beams, the old saying that we used to use.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and these little details, when I ask for something like that, it's not just to make a question, but sometimes the little details are huge. I mean, to flip this over a way, I think about when MUFON asked me to help them with a case that wasn't making any sense out in Winnipeg. And when I looked into that, when you looked at how it was covered in the press, it always said the two amateur astronomers. And when I tracked them down and spoke to them, it turned out that they were not two amateur astronomers, they were two men with a telescope, which is a very
Hmm.
different thing, right?
Yep. Yep.
And all the details started to unravel. In the end, there was still a UFO sighting, but the understanding changed. So those little details can make or break it. While we're talking, as you so well encapsulated what happened here in this recent Escazone sighting, what was the date of Escazone? I know Cole Harbor, you said, was just
The best
2021.
Yeah, Cole
Yeah,
Harbor, they had the exact date, April 25th, because that
yeah,
would have been reported to MUFON. The best that the RCMP officer could give me was March of 2020, just after all the pandemic restrictions came in
right,
place. So that would have been the week of like the 13th, I believe.
right. So since they didn't have the date, that means they didn't do any paperwork or file in a report due to
I
their
asked her,
sighting.
I asked her if they created a police report,
Yeah,
and they didn't, just because they were on patrol. It was just something that they had witnessed. It wasn't a call or anything like that, so there was no paper generated on it. You wouldn't be able to probably find any other information about this unless you spoke to the RCMP officer like I did.
yeah. And you know something? Let's just dip away from UFOs just for a minute because of the location here, the sighting in Escazone. About, I don't know when this would have been produced. It was, I believe, a British documentary I saw 15 or 20 years ago. And it centered on four stories of the paranormal. Well, mostly it was UFO, but one of them was centered in Escazone, Cape Breton. And it was about an attack at I believe it was like an outdoor picnic, family picnic, by a group of what we would simply call little people. And by little people, literally something more what you would describe as a leprechaun than a 4 foot alien, these little things. And the strange thing about it, that's not my forte. But if you'd seen how it was portrayed in this, the evidence and the sincerity of the people from Escazone, it caught my attention, because I've seen this kind of strong emotional involvement in so many UFO cases, and uh, I found it just fascinating. These people, this was their reality, and they believed it. And as much as I accept things like some of the kooky things you run into in UFO cases that exhibit reality transformation, we did an episode on that once.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it was hard to fathom, but it was striking. But I'll tell you, I wanted to get more of it, and I could never find a follow up or a source. And a couple times in passing through the community, I wish I'd had more information on it. But it made me sit up and take note. And if you'd asked me, Chris, what do you think about stories about little people? I thought, oh God, spare me, please. But to hear this, I would have loved to have met them. I would have loved to have investigated it, to be honest. So you have to keep an open mind with these things, right? So anyway, Escazonia, and a beautiful place. Is that the largest native? It's a reserve, isn't it? I think, Elliot,
It
Escazonia
is, yeah,
stat.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's got about 4,000 people in it, I believe.
yeah,
Not
yeah,
too far from Sydney, Nova Scotia. I know the RCMP officers that work in Escazone usually park their police cars at the Cambridge suites. You'll always see RCMP cars parked there, and
yes,
that's why,
yeah,
because
yeah.
most of them live in Sydney and then drive out.
Okay, well, let's hop a province over. And one of the other sightings I know you cover in your book is the one that occurred in Oromocto.
Yeah,
Um,
this is an older UFO sighting, but I really like it because it's not just a light in the sky. It actually had a physical component to it. This one occurred March 13th, 1973, and I got this information. You know, either you had given it to me when we shared Freedom of Information Act stuff that we had gotten, or
mm,
it was something that I picked up in the Burt Gaffney files, one of the
mhm,
two. But basically, it was a New Brunswick RCMP file 73-400-2, and the lady's name was Marilyn Abbott. She reported a UFO encounter. She was on the Highway 7, and it was around 11:40 at night. And there was an object that she could see in the night sky, kind of shaped like the moon, but the size of a vehicle. She described it as being a bright, non-fluorescent white with kind of a white halo around the exterior of the object. There was no sound at all coming from the object, and when she noticed that it was getting closer to her, she increased her car speed to approximately 50, 60 miles per hour. And once the object was completely overhead of her, her vehicle completely died, stalled out, and it wouldn't restart. And her headlights had gone out, everything had gone out. She was driving a standard shift vehicle at the time and could not get it started. So she jumped out of her car and ran to a nearby home for help. She had to run, it was only approximately 50 yards. And when she turned back to look at her car, she noticed that the object was gone and that the car lights had turned back on. But she made it to the neighbor's residence, and fearing that they wouldn't believe her story, she had asked if she could call her father and just told
Hmm.
them that she was having car trouble. Um, so she ended up calling her neighbor, and when they went back to the car again, they saw that the car lights were back on, and that
Hmm.
the object was gone. She was clearly distraught, and her dad actually had the idea to call the RCMP to report it. So the Oromocto Town RCMP police had attended. They had noted in their report that she did appear to be, a credible witness. She was quite distraught by the incident.
Hmm.
So they actually decided that they would bring her to the hospital and follow up with her the next day. When she went to the hospital, they ended up having to give her a sedative to calm her down. So obviously, this was a very impactful incident.
Hmm.
The next day, the investigating officer had attended her residence and spoke to her and her dad, and they talked about where the vehicle had stopped. They talked about the object. Um, of course, the RCMP then tried to verify as much information that they could. They contacted the control tower at Fredericton Airport to see if there was any flights in the area between, I think they asked for 11 p.m. to 12:20 a.m. that evening. They also contacted the Canadian Forces base in Gagetown because New Brunswick's a big military province. And there was no helicopters, no aircraft that evening. The RCMP officer even went back to the area where it happened and couldn't find any other witnesses. And eventually, he exhausted all of his investigative avenues, and the file was concluded. He even dug into whether or not the witness was possibly using drugs or anything that night, but she hadn't had any drugs or alcohol. Followed up with the hospital as well before concluding his report to ask them if she was on any sort of drugs or anything like that, but they also verified that she wasn't. And the UFO sighting remained unexplained. And of course, at that point, the police have to move on and continue on their duties. So he had no choice but to conclude the file at that point. I mean, he had done everything reasonable that you would expect, a paid police officer to do in that UFO case. But I thought that one was really interesting because it's a credible witness. It's more than just a light in the sky. It actually caused the vehicle
Yeah.
to stop. And I find cases like that are, especially in today with all the satellites and all the drones and things that are available. When you get UFO reports of just a light in the sky, um, like it's interesting to us, but it's I find the ones that do something like they leave a scorch mark or they shut
Hmm.
something down or they
A
cause some sort of
physical,
interference.
yeah, a physical effect, some kind of interaction, indicating at least some type of physical object or phenomena. Um, you got to give the RCMP their due here. A lot of effort for, I'm sure what most law enforcement agencies around the world, sheriff's departments, whatever it is, wouldn't have put that effort into it, And I know they
No, I
don't
don't.
do that in each and every case, but they probably were moved by the emotional reaction of the woman and the fact that they felt it prudent to take her to hospital. And, I think, some credit is deserved there for that. Now, 73, I was in high school. And in rough numbers, I know back then we only had about 2,000 things in orbit, including all the space junk and lost screwdrivers, etc., from the early manned missions. But they were able to keep pretty good track of everything, and none of this speaks of that anyway in terms of the details. So, but no, I'd agree.
No,
That's a great case. Yeah. you know?
Yeah, that one's a good one because, like you said, back then there wouldn't have been as much space debris, and
Yeah.
I mean, the police back then when they got a call, they would investigate something like that, um, more
Mhm.
thoroughly. Also, as you know, the RCMP used to investigate UFOs back then between them and the National Joint Council. So that was something that they would pay more attention to. If you got a call like that today in Halifax, I would
Mhm.
imagine, they'll respond to it, but then that would be it. I don't think you would see them running all over the city trying to interview witnesses and things like that. It would have to be quite a significant sighting for that to happen.
There would have to be some other type of involvement, but I mean, they still do. I mean, I often say that, when you work for something, when your profession is like air traffic controller or RCMP officer, you don't get the luxury of disbelief. And to their credit, you know,
Hmm.
today it might take a few more reports or for a switchboard to light up or the modern equivalent of that. But the thing is, at some point, you just can't. When something enters the airspace or threatens a community or an area or something crashes down, you have no choice but to investigate. So they are still looked into, but yeah, perhaps there's a little more scrutiny now before you rev up the engines and get out there in the field. But yeah, no, that's a great one. And the thing is, that's back in that period when I loved about this. And I mentioned this before. When you go through those RG-77 files, I
Yeah.
think this is so Canadian too. I love it when you get those ones that at the top of the HQ 400 Q5 form, which is the name of the form that was used then in the RCMP. I love it when you get those ones that say complaint of UFO,
Hmm.
and they start that way. And there's many great ones like that. So let's zip across the country and a few pages deeper into the book here at this point, sort of thing. And go now. Here's a Canadian name that would be hard to beat. If there's anything that comes across as a community name that's couldn't be anywhere else, there's Moose Jaw. Why
Yes.
don't you tell us about Moose Jaw?
This was a really interesting one because it came from my brother-in-law, who's a retired master corporal with the Air Force, and his job with the Air Force was aerospace control operator, or a fancy name for air traffic controller.
Mm-hmm.
My brother-in-law Andrew Baird spent about the same amount of time I did with the RCMP. Spent 15 years with the Royal Canadian Air Force doing air traffic control.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And of course, there's no better witness to a UFO sighting than air traffic controller. He remembers this one quite distinctly because it was kind of unique. So it was in August 2009, and he was working an evening shift in the control tower, and there were some CT 155 Hawks doing some training, and
Mm-hmm.
they were doing nighttime exercises. And shortly after midnight, Andrew looked towards the city of Moose Jaw and he observed a kind of a strange bright white light hovering in the night sky. And it looked similar to when an aircraft activates its landing lights, but it was the brightest white light that he had ever seen. And it was a perfect white circle and there was no glare at all. And he knew it wasn't a plane because there was no anti collision lights activated and no red flashing lights. So he told the other air traffic controller about it, and they checked the traffic sheets, and there was no reported aircraft flying over the city. So the air traffic controller told Andrew to call Regina Tower, and they called them, and there was no air traffic being reported from them either. And they also made a call to Saskatoon, and of course, they didn't have anything to report either. So Andrew and his coworker kind of continued to monitor the strange light, and then one of the Hawk pilots had radioed the tower and asked them about the light in the sky. So now the pilots had discovered the light. So they updated the pilots, just saying that they had noticed it. They've been checking into it. They can't seem to figure out what it is. The lead instructor had asked them permission to go and investigate it, and they gave them permission to approach the object. The pilot began approaching the light, and when he was about halfway to where the object was in the sky, the light shot straight up into the sky and just disappeared, um, which is
Hmm.
interesting because it's going up back into space and not down. So you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking meteorite or whatnot.
Mm.
and then it just disappeared. So the military personnel, including Andrew and his partner, they were totally in disbelief. Uh, the object did not show up on their radar, and it was designed to capture both. The radar that they were using was designed to capture both military and civilian air traffic. So they
Mhm.
called North Bay, Ontario, to see if they could play back their radar recordings and see if any object showed up on their screen. And North Bay had advised them that they didn't have anything of what they described flying over Moose Jaw at that time. So after that, Andrew had to complete an incident report because it was a strange and unusual event. So he recorded what he had witnessed and saw and put it into the logbook. And then they faxed it to Winnipeg for further investigation. And then some Winnipeg investigators will investigate it, but they don't ever disclose what happened, back to the person that reported it. It's kind of like you report it and then
Mm.
it goes to another part of the military, and then you never know kind of what happened.
Our tax
Uh,
dollars at work.
yeah.
I'm
So
sorry,
then,
I have to be critical of that, you know? I can
no,
remember
no,
going
it's
anyway, go
true.
on.
You
Yeah,
you would you would think that you'd get some sort of update, but yeah, they just
sure.
kind of completely shut you out once you give them the information
Yeah.
that they want. So a few days after the incident, Andrew was on his days off. He returned to work. He was sitting in the air traffic control tower, and he began telling another coworker about the incident that had occurred a few nights ago. And the coworker didn't believe him. And Andrew went and grabbed the logbook and went to go show him the entry, and the page had been ripped out of the book. And the only time
Mm.
that you're supposed to rip a page out of the logbook, according to Andrew, was if there's an aviation accident. That's the only time that they would rip a page out of the logbook. And of course, when he asked questions, he never could find anything else out. No one seemed to know what happened to the page or what happened after the Winnipeg investigators got involved. So I found that case really interesting because it came from
Mm.
a personal, credible witness. So yeah, that's a strange one.
So it sounds like there's a few things here that's outside normal policy or handling how, the page ripping and that. Um, I'll just give you one real quick thing where I found every now and then, you do get this something unusual and it may make a few hairs stand up on the back of your neck. I remember once looking for something from the Directorate of History. It was actually the 1967 copy of what's known as the Annual Strokers Report. And what that is, that's a record of major target detections done on radar and the NORAD system and that. And the person I spoke to suggested I look at it in terms of Shag Harbor. This is years ago now because there was very likely something there. And she had looked at the book recently and knew where it was. This assistant there called me back 10 minutes later and said, I can't understand this, but the book is missing. I had it the other
Mm.
day and blah, blah, blah. And she went on, there will be an investigation and all this, and I'll get back to you. About a month or two later, I'd not heard anything back, so I called up again, and she said, "Oh yes, the book did turn up." And she suddenly put on this very monotone, obviously phony voice and said to me, we looked and, oh yes, there was nothing in it that referred. I'm not going to try to imitate the voice, but it was obviously, I was to read a message out of that. Her hands were tied as to the words she could choose, but she let me know there'd been some funny business and the call ended like that. So, you do get those little things every now and then that show the hand of government. Well, we're all part of the government. That you work for the government, this sort of thing. That doesn't mean it's always sinister or untoward or below board or above board or whatever. But what it does mean is that sometimes procedures aren't adhered to, and where policy and procedure doesn't fit the slot exactly, they ad lib occasionally, and tend to err on the side of caution. Look, you mentioned North Bay and that they conferred with them. You have a case from North Bay in the book too, don't you? Why don't you tell
I
us
do,
about
and
that one
I do, and
before?
it came from Andrew again because he was stationed in North Bay as well.
Mm-hmm.
So when he was there, North Bay is also the center, like you were saying, for NORAD operations in Canada as well, um,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of interesting. But so he was working there, and there were a couple of incidents where objects were appearing at approximately 65,000 to 68,000 feet, and they were being tracked on radar. And the speed showed that they were moving extremely slow for aviation, between 22 and 20 knots, and the objects couldn't be identified. And there was times where the military air traffic controllers were ordered to drop the tracking of that object. Now, Andrew had told me that commercial flights usually fly between 25,000 and 45,000 feet. And the
Mm.
highest flying commercial flight was the Concorde, which had the capability of flying at 60,000 feet. So even our most known, man-made object, the Concorde, which, would tap out around 60,000 feet, this was still another 5 to 8,000 feet higher than that. Um, and they retired the Concorde in 2003, I believe, as well.
Mm.
Um, and of course, they would check for weather balloons as well, to see if the old weather balloon story. I always laugh when I hear that because I think of Roswell. But you know,
Mm.
weather balloons have been known to be misidentified as flying objects, but there was no weather balloons or anything like that. The radar
Mm.
technicians were also called out multiple times. Andrew said, to check the functionality of the equipment to make sure that it was in proper working order and that it wasn't misreading something. But the
Mhm.
technicians advised that everything was fine, and that they also ruled out any reflections that the radar was picking up or solar flares. And they never did find out what those anomalies were, but they were flying again between 65 and 68,000 feet, which is higher
Mm.
than our conventional objects.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some things get up that high. I think things like the old SR-71 Blackbird get up that high, but they certainly do more than 22 knots to achieve that altitude and maintain it. So that would strike it from the list, and it's an
Well,
unlikely candidate anyway.
Well, that's the
But
other, yeah, the other thing is the speed as well. Like, if you could achieve that height, then the speed doesn't kind of match, what you'd have to be doing. So,
yeah, well, I mean, the Blackbird to get that high and to stay there was doing 3,000 miles per hour. Um, with North Bay, I'll tell you something. You're aware, of course, of the sighting that I had with Justin Brown and the video we shot back on Cape Sable in
oh yeah.
2018. I just jumped to that. I'm not going to tell that story or anything, but when you talk about North Bay, there's a little place very near North Bay. I think it's less than 10 miles, Mattawa, Ontario. And in
Hmm.
2017, there was a sighting of exactly the same UFO type that we saw in Cape Sable. And there were, images taken of it and that. And that drifted right over North Bay. That would have been 50 weeks to the day, almost 1 year before the sighting we had on Cape Sable. And that was over in Mattawa, Ontario. And basically, it was that sort of translucent sphere with a cube inside, and very similar to descriptions of the UFOs that were seen off the deck and flight operations of the Theodore Roosevelt in the Atlantic. Not the Tic Tac sightings, but these would have been the ones, I think it was 2014, right? So, North Bay, there's another place, right? Now,
Yeah, it's interesting. Whenever there's like lots of military activity, or in that report that the U.S. released late last year, around nuclear sites, there seems to be a lot of UFO sightings. Anywhere where there's
sure.
military installations or nuclear sites.
Yeah. Now those sightings that I'd mentioned there, and that nuclear sightings, and of course, not so much has been made of these carrier-based sightings, like the so-called Tic Tac sightings in the Pacific Theater, and the ones in the Atlantic there with the Teddy Roosevelt, and some of the pilots have spoke. There's been great interviews in the New York Times. Um, and of course, as a result of that, and I firmly believe that we would not be talking about this, and the Pentagon would have never released that if Lou Elizondo's group had not leaked the leak to them,
Hmm.
originally about those stories. But once that happened, and once the Pentagon made its release, this has put pressure around the world. And I think you've recently got on to something that our defense minister, was briefed on this, and why don't you fill us
Yeah,
in on that, Elliot?
Yeah, so of course I always keep an eye out on the news for any parapsychological news or any UFO news or anything like that. So I'm usually scanning, CNN, CTV, CBC, Google News, and I came across an article that was just released by CTV recently, saying that the Canadian Defence Minister was briefed on unidentified flying objects ahead of the big USA intel report that was released, like you and I had just talked about there,
Mm-hmm.
where it mentions that they don't know what the objects are and that they're hanging around nuclear sites and things like that. But it was interesting. So what had basically happened is when everyone had the heads up that the U.S. was going to release this intelligence on UFOs, somebody within the Canadian government felt that they should collect the information from the U.S. and brief Canadian Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan at the time when he was the defense minister. So they actually compiled a little PowerPoint presentation for him, and which is interesting. And then the CTV ended up getting a copy of it, and they entitled it "Unidentified Aerial Phenomena," which is kind of the new term that is being used now in the UFO field. Briefing to Minister of National Defense. And it's kind of interesting because they actually consider, we had mentioned Chris Rakowski earlier, and in the PowerPoint slide, they actually consider him to be kind of like their go-to civilian expert because of his work the great work that he's done on, with the University of Manitoba and the Canadian UFO Survey. They actually
Mm-hmm.
call him Canada's preeminent ufologist. So it's pretty cool. But in the PowerPoint slide, to the minister, they were talking about Canada usually has approximately 1,000 unexplained UFO sightings each year. That bunch of different organizations are responsible for collecting the data, which includes Transport Canada, NAV Canada, the National Research Council, like we talked about before, and the RCMP, and then, of course, the Department of National Defense. They included some recent examples, which were cool. December 23rd of 2018 in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, there was lights reported by both a witness on land and one at sea, and 3 primary radar returns were recorded at the observed location. So that was kind of interesting. And then they said
Mm-hmm.
on May 9th of 2021 in Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan, a Delta Airline Boeing 737 coming from Fairbanks to Minneapolis was cruising at 39,000 feet when the pilot asked the air traffic controller about traffic that was moving above them from right to left, which was interesting. And then I also thought it was kind of interesting in the report, too, that they said in 1995 is when the RCMP and the National Research Council kind of stopped being involved in investigating UFOs, like formally, where they would have the policy to actually investigate it. Of course, if you called the police today and reported a UFO sighting, they'd still have to investigate it. But it was taken a lot more serious back then in the 70s,
Yeah.
80s, 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That
so
that
it was interesting.
Yeah, the setup to that actually goes back to Shag Harbor and the Falcon Lake case, because
Mm,
those cases and a couple of others were often cited in documents then, and the transfer was arranged to remove UFO responsibilities and investigations from the Royal Canadian Air Force and give it to the National Research Council, which happened officially on January the 8th, 1968. And at first, there were 2 professors put in charge of that whole operation, Professor Tennyson from the University of Toronto and Rupert McNeil from Acadia University. And they had a setup where they were to draw field units when necessary. They would just call the RCMP or whatever. These guys were very serious and did research, but they never did invoke the ability to call in field units. When they retired, a couple of other props took over, but were less serious about it. And as the years rolled by, eventually it just became something like the old Blue Book setup in the States, where it was just a file system and a couple of majors and that. And then eventually all the files ended up at the Herzberg Institute on Sussex Drive down the street from the Prime Minister. And by 95, they lost interest, and by 99 they officially refused to even accept the reports, and officially that was the end of our research as a nation into UFOs. Although, like you say, if something active happens, if something splashes down, and you call for the RCMP or the military's called in, they do their duty. They have to, like anything else, you know. But yeah, that it sort of quietly went to bed, but it started in the 60s and petered out by 95, 99, depending on when you want to call it official. Now,
Mm.
yeah, let's come up to the present. Actually, no, let's go right past the present and here to the future. Um, well, the near future next year. I understand that the PPRI and yourself are going to have a conference in Halifax, right? You have a location, you have a date, and all that, and
Yes, we do.
tell it.
It's been quite a process. It's something that we wanted to do a couple years ago before COVID hit, and then once COVID hit, of course, just like everything else, it went off the
Oh,
rails.
I
But
think you
now
know.
that
I know all how hard that is. How hard that is. I'm still trying to get one that we had dated from before COVID resurrected. God bless it. Our speakers have all stuck with us. I might just mention it later, but you go on. I'm sorry I
yeah,
interrupted,
yeah, I'm
but
looking I'm looking forward to that one too.
it's
Um,
hard.
So yeah, so basically, we just kept delaying planning of it, and then we wanted to have it this year, but Daryl Walsh actually talked me out of having it this year because I'm getting married August 6th, and then the conference would have been in
Ah,
October. So he didn't want too much planning to go on all in one year, so we decided to do it next year, which is great. We found and signed our contract for the venue, so the venue is going to be at the brand new Halifax Tower Hotel. The events manager took us on a tour there, Daryl and I, and the place is gorgeous. It's all tile. It's all they have a bar which is kind of it look almost like an old style gentleman's kind of bar. They've got a new restaurant that they're building right in the hotel called La Rouge. Um, their second floor is dedicated to all meeting rooms and spaces, and it looks like it's going to be phenomenal. Free parking as well, and they're going to give all our guests that decide to stay there, if you want to stay at the hotel, 10% off the hotel room. So we were
yeah.
very happy with the venue. So we signed the contract with them. It'll be held on Saturday, October the 14th of 2023. Uh, Initially, we wanted to do a 2-day event, but where it's our first one, we're going to do a 1-day event, and we're going to have 5 guest speakers. I was hoping that you would be one of my 5 guest speakers. I'd love for you to come and do a UFO presentation on a case that you've worked on, because the theme for this paranormal symposium is going to be either case files or case studies. And I think that's kind of what the general public would be most interested in is, everyone loves watching the paranormal TV shows and documentaries and things like that. And I think if we had real life investigators and experts in the field come and tell them about a real case that they've worked on, I think that that would generate a lot of interest.
Well, if that's an invitation, how could I say no? I'm so there. You know, you've got me sold. And by the way, you're wise to do a 1 day event there. You know, some of the best ones I've gone to are 1 day events. They used to have annual 1 day ones years ago down in New Hampshire. Peter Jeremiah would put on the state MUFON group, and they would sell out every year. And he used to get the best guests. He'd have astronauts. He'd have, oh, it was fantastic. But anyway, thank you, Ellie. Yeah, no, I'm there. And I've not forgotten what you've done for us there back when we had a small time event there last in Shag Harbor. You donated your effort to us there. And I said the next time we had a real event, and they have been put off by COVID, but we're hoping this year's the year, and that in October, the first weekend of October 2022, finally, that we're going to have our Shag Harbor UFO event in Yarmouth in the Grand Hotel. God bless them. All our speakers have stayed with us. We have 5 U.S. speakers and myself there, and they've hung in every year wanting to be part of this. And this
That's a
looks
great
like the
lineup
year.
too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, geez, we're lucky to get people like Nick Pope and David Marler, Debbie Z, Rob. Ryan Sprague. These are preeminent people in the field, and they've stuck with us all along. And each year we've had to cancel. They say they've understand. And I said, listen, if you want to bow out, but they've all stayed with us, and I'm impressed by that. And hopefully this year, COVID willing, it'll finally come together. And you, of course, have a ticket there, gratis there, to be at the event for helping us out in the leaner years and that. The early ticket sales have been brisk this year. We're doing well. And, there's been support from the community, including financial support. People want this to work. As you know, there's been a change of provincial government here, and they seem to be a little more geared to every time the numbers fluctuate of keeping things open. So our fingers are crossed, and we're hoping this is finally it. And by the next year, you should be a little more padded. I'm sure there are people in the audience, though, when they hear Daryl Walsh, thinking of you personally, and God bless him. I know why he would do that. You guys have had a long working relationship, but I'm sure there's a lot of people that are going, damn, I'd love to go to that this year, but they'll have to
Yeah.
wait another
Well,
year.
we may plan something this year. We did hold an event last year. It was October, just before
Mm.
Halloween, at the Westin Hotel. We chose that location because the Westin Hotel has a history of being haunted. And actually, during that event, Daryl believes that he saw a ghost, and it was the first ghost that he's ever
Cool.
seen. But what happened is, so we held this event at the Westin, and um, you couldn't find any ghost stories on it. If you Google the Westin Hotel and haunted ghost stories, you won't come up with anything. But what happened is my dog groomer used to work at the Westin Hotel. So when I told her about the event that we were having there, she actually filled me in on a personal ghost story that she had, along with some of the other ones that guests had told her. Like she said, when she was working the front counter one time, there was her and her partner were working the front counter, and a female came running down the stairwell, soaking wet in nothing but a towel, saying that she was getting a shower and a female apparition had come into the bathroom, and it freaked her out and disappeared. And then she ran down to the lobby to report it. Um, and then my dog groomer herself said that one night she had rented a room for her parents, and they went out to Halifax, enjoyed themselves, and then they went back to the room, ordered some room service. And when they were finished eating, Jamie thought it would be nice if she brought the plates down to the kitchen, so the staff didn't have to do it. So she used the service elevator that the staff do. And when she opened the door, there was a gentleman there, all in black, a long 3/4 length black dress coat, with a like a black fedora on. He kind of had his face down so you couldn't see his eyes. So she was a little bit creeped out. She was a young girl at the time, 19. Um, kind of had a bad feeling she shouldn't get on the elevator, but she's from Cape Breton, so she has that jovial personality about her. So she said, "How you doing tonight?" And there was no response. She got into the elevator, pushed down to the kitchen. The doors opened up. She stepped out, turned around to say goodnight to the guy. Gone. Nobody in the elevator with her. She
Wow.
was she was so freaked out that she went back to her parents' room, and instead of going home that night, she ended up staying in the hotel room with her parents. So it was really cool. So when we were there, the staff that was catering our event um, had told us about the little boy on the floor where all the conference rooms are. Apparently, there's a little boy that the staff often see, and sometimes he's seen dribbling a basketball, and other times you can just hear the sound of a basketball dribbling, but you don't see anything. So as I'm telling the story to the crowd, Daryl decides to venture out and go down to the Atlantic room, which is where the little boy is often seen. It's their huge kind of ballroom, a lot of wedding receptions and things like that happen there. And when he went into the room, to the left, when he looked to the left, he saw what he thought was a little girl dive underneath the table. And when the little girl dove underneath the table, he said the tablecloth moved, but it wasn't the real tablecloth. It was almost like a translucent tablecloth that had moved. So he could like see like a translucent tablecloth move, but
Hmm.
the actual tablecloth didn't move. So of course he was freaked out. He's in there by himself, and he's very very skeptical for anyone that knows him. So he was having trouble trying to digesting what was happening to him. He eventually got his nerve up, went over to the table, lifted it up. There was nobody underneath there. He took some photos with his cell phone, and then he came back to the room. And my mom actually was attending the event, and she's got a lot of intuition to her. She's not a medium or anything like that, but she's sensitive. So he brought her into the room, and she just kind of got a bad feeling in the room. And then there was an actual medium that had attended our event, so they brought her in, and she kind of had the perception that he might have been there at the hotel at one time, involved in a wedding, and she could sense a few different tragedies that had happened at the hotel, suicides and things like that. Um, and then yeah, that was kind of it. So then at the end of the night, I think we finished up. It was pretty late by the time we packed everything up. I think we're clocking on close to midnight or so, and I was carrying down. We brought some haunted objects to the event and things like that. And Daryl's like, "Are you going to go in the room?" And I was like, "Well, no. Like, I just want to get home. I'm tired. I've been speaking for like 3 hours."
Mm.
And he's like, "Well, you're right here." So I was like, "Okay, I'll go in the room, I guess." So I was kind of annoyed. I wasn't really thinking like ghosts or anything like that. Just wanted to get home. And I went into the room, and it was ice cold just because the air conditioning was on, but it was like freezing in there. And I walked in there, and I didn't like the feeling in there either. You felt like you weren't welcome in there, and my stomach actually started to get like really sick. Like I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was kind of laughing to myself inside because I always make fun of a certain ghost hunter on television that always feels sick all the time, and I knew that my fiance Sarah was going to make fun of me for this, so I ended up telling her the story, and she laughed because she knows, I usually crap all over the ghost hunting shows that are on TV. So she was laughing
Mm.
because I was experiencing like the same kind of thing that they portray on TV. But it was, yeah, well, it was not a very welcoming room. It would be really interesting to do an investigation there, but the Westin is not really pro paranormal. The company that owns it kind of likes to keep it quiet, almost like the hotel you see in Ghostbusters, where they want to keep Slimer quiet and
Ah.
not disrupt the guests, kind of thing. That's kind of the mentality there at the Westin.
Yeah. Our time's winding down, so let me just give you, if we stay within the hour, I got time to tell you the UFO equivalent of your story there. You were down with us, weren't we, in Shag Harbor the year they had the coin for sale, the commemorative
Yes.
coin that came out by the mint. I believe you came and went that day. You didn't stay overnight in the area, did you? You were,
No,
I
I
think,
was just
went
down
back
for the
to
day.
Metro. Well, that night, you might remember there were two girls that were down, female staffers from the Mint, that represented and gave away a couple of commemorative coins. They gave one to me and one to Lori for their help. And, they were down just for the event, and to make a presentation from the Mint. Well, that night, one of the girls had family in the area in Shelburne, and they were staying around, and they were going to a few of the local watering holes and enjoying themselves. But when they got back to their motel there in the Shag Harbor area, they thought they'd seen something in the sky, and they tried to film it with their phones. Now, they readily admit they were quite inebriated in that, and, but like Stanton Friedman used to point out, as he says, drunks see UFOs too, right? And they were probably at that state. But it was also very interesting because they were looking, because they weren't the only people to report this, and they were seeing lights over Cape Sable that were unusual. Now, they tried to film these, and the distance and all the other parameters involved, and the quality of the cell phone, the videos were pretty much useless, but they made the attempt. But what was interesting to me was they were outside watching this for an extended period and commenting and talking about it. And what was interesting is every now and then one of these girls had to rush back to the motel room to use the washroom, the facilities. And every time they did, the other one would be in there, would continue talking about what she was seeing, along with trying to attempt to film whatever it was causing the sighting. And here's the cool part is that every time they would part and one of them would go into the washroom, the other one would start disagreeing with what the other one had just said. And she'd be saying, no, no, that's not like what they were talking about today, the scene. That doesn't look like that at all. And if you hadn't looked at the poor video or the fact that yes, these two people were inebriated, but I'll tell you, when they were separated, they were very quick to disagree with the other as to what they're seeing. And almost, if it had been under better conditions and there had been some better evidence, it would have been a great reality transformation case, one of these ones where people are perceiving the event together but differently. And it's kind of cute and it's funny, but I listened to the recordings many times. They're quite lengthy, and these people are serious. And that brings up to the end. Is there a website for your event coming up yet?
Yeah, it's at ppri.net. If you go to ppri.net, click our events section, you'll see Halifax Paranormal Symposium, and it's got all the details on there. And of course, the website has my contact information, little store section that has links to where you can purchase my books. It's pretty much a one-stop shop.
Yeah, well, there you go. The PPRI has you covered for 2023. If you want to go to something this fall that's a little bit different, off the norm, there it is. They got the paranormal covered, and this year we'll have it covered here. The Shag Harbor Incident Society is putting on the Shag Harbor UFO Expo. If you go to that Shag Harbor UFO Expo.com online, you will find all you need to know and of the updates. Look, it's been a pleasure, Elliott, having you back for round 2 here, sort of thing. I'm sure we'll be just. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to be honored to present at your event in 2023. And you know what? I'm going to have something entirely new beyond Shag Harbor. Then I've been dropping hints now and then, haven't got a lot to say about it. I'm working on a manuscript, but all should be revealed by then, as you'll see, and you'll get one of the early presentations. So, pleasure as always to have you here. You're welcome anytime. Hopefully, we'll see you again in the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you for agreeing to be a part of the Paranormal Symposium. I think it's going to be
Oh, yes.
fantastic.
Got to be there, man. That's it.